Chris Smith said damn, and then he asked what the fuck was that some kind of laser blast coming out of your hands, and he asked me are you some kind of metahumans, and I said no not exactly, that's called ki energy, it's life force energy. Chris Smith, it's a type of martial arts, actually it can be learned and mastered, and he said hey wait a fucking minute, teach me how to do please, and I said I don't know Harley, should I teach him, and she said well I don't know, and Harley said he looks immature and irresponsible, and I said after this is all over I will train you Chris, and Chris Smith smiled big and he said thanks man, and I smiled back looking at the face of a man I admired greatly in my previous life for his exploits in the WWE as John Cena, and yes I'm still a fan of John Cena, and this Chris Smith looks just like him, and I said Chris I want to help you, I have the powers to bring your brother Keith Smith back as a grown man, and he said really, and I said yes really, but you have to join my team the Justice League, and he said sure man, whatever I have to do to learn what you got and to get my brother back. And then as soon as Bloodsport made his flawed plan I decided to show him my trump card destruction energy, and while Starro was on a rampage I shot at saving Polka Dot Man and the others, and then I blew off my smoking fingers like a gun, and I said who needs a gun when you have ki energy that could kill anything even a giant, and then I got rid of all the miniature Starros, and then I teleported everyone to my Ellsworth building and I set them all up with a nice room, and then I took Chris to a nice open space and I explained I have these things called Dragon Balls, they are a type of wishing orbs that can grant any wish, and I want to help you get what you want, and then I summoned the mighty dragon Shenron, and Shenron said I am the strongest dragon. Shenron, speak your 7 wishes and they shall be granted, and then Chris Smith said holy shit he's massive, and then I said go on Chris Smith, and then I said don't wish for that right now, and he said oh man, and I said not right now because I have the powers to do it, I will get it done Chris, don't worry, and then I said you know what, let me do it, and then he said okay man it's your dragon Shenron, and I said thanks, and I said mighty dragon Shenron I want you to bring Chris Smith back to life as a grown man and with no bad memories of the past and on this earth and right here where we are standing, and then Shenron's eyes glowed bright red, and then Keith Smith appeared as a grown man in front of us, and then I said you can go now Shenron, and then Shenron said until we meet again, and Chris said Keith do you remember me, and Keith said Chris is that you little brother, and Chris said yes you died Keith and we brought you back, and then I said I have to give him the shot Chris, and then Chris said wait, and I said nope I'm not waiting, and then I gave Keith Smith the shot really fast, and then Keith said ouch what the hell, and then Chris said don't worry about it, it's a special shot that pretty much makes you superhuman, I know this because I got shot many times and I didn't die after taking that shot, you heal incredibly fast, it pretty much makes you unstoppable with superhuman strength, and then I said we need to go to your dad's house and show him the good news, and then Chris said I don't want to see that asshole, and then Keith said I want to see dad, and then Chris said he's a racist asshole Keith, and Keith said I know but he's still out dad Chris, maybe we can change him, and Chris said oh fine, and I said I am coming with you, and then I teleported them to Augie Smith's house, and then I had Keith hide behind a wall on the other side of the door, and then Chris rung the doorbell and Augie said we don't want any, and Chris said it's me dad, and then Augie said go away, and then Chris continued knocking and he said I'm not leaving, answer the door please, and then Augie answered the door and said what the hell do you want, and I said I came here to show you and tell you good news, and then his dad said spill it, and then Chris looked at Keith and nodded, and then Keith said hi dad, and then Augie looked like he had seen a ghost, and Augie stumbled backwards and fell on his back, and he said no this is not possible, you died, we buried you, and then I said I can vouch for this, I brought your son back to life Mr. Augie, your sons are now working for me in the Justice League, and Augie said Batman what the hell have you done boy, you brought the Batman here, he's going to put us in prison, and I said calm down, I'm not going to do anything to you, I know about your alien door and I have no interest in it, I came to offer you and your family a job as working heroes and part of my personal security force, and it pays very well, and then I said could you please stand up so we can sit down like civilized people, and then Augie stood up and grunted and said please sit down and please tell me what is going on.